Hi, I'm Teresa Coenen with Stitch and Tree Quilts, and this is row 2 of our quilt, COVID Friends Tribute Quilt. Let's take a look at some fabric options for the Baby Bunting block. This is my bright batiks with a back background. This is my bright blenders with a directional background. This is my deep and rich blenders. And this is my deep and rich batiks. Let's take a look at the choices that I made for each one. We're getting far enough along in our quilt. We're on our 6th block now that you should be able to look at all of your blocks and make sure that you're using all 8 of the colors that we have in our quilt in all of your units. So I had noticed that I wasn't using enough yellows and oranges. That's why you see that represented here. You can use directional fabric for the 4-patch. Using directional fabric for the half squares can be problematic because these half squares are at one angle and these half squares are at another. This grassy fabric that I have actually is a bit of a directional fabric, but I positioned my half squares in a way that they make sense on the unit. On my bright blenders, using directional fabric in the background, it will be near impossible unless you're cutting on a diagonal to get all of these to go the same direction. So once again, I purposefully am jumbling mine up. The 4-patch unit itself would be a place that you could fussy cut fabrics and have units in that 4-patch if you like. Things to think about with your baby bunting is if you had a grandchild or a child and it was a boy or a girl, you might want to incorporate some colors related to that baby in your block. Whatever that you choose, you want to make sure you have good contrast between the points of your block and your background fabric, as I did in each of these. When cutting your units for the Baby Bunting block, your background fabrics, you should have what you need left over from block 4. Left over from block 4, the Faith Forever block. The 3 7/8 inch square, you should have one left over from row 1. If you don't have those left over, you're going to need to cut some units. I like to use a Marty Michelle square up ruler because it has the 1/8 inch markings, which you need for the 2 3/8 inch squares or the 3 7/8. It makes it very easy to cut those. And then I personally like to use any Marty Michelle half square. This happens to be a flying geese, so that I can engineer those corners and I don't have to worry about dog ears. In step 1, you're to take your fabric 1 and fabric 2 squares and stitch them together right sides together. If you have directional fabric, make sure you pay attention to your direction. I've already got my 2 pieces stitched together here, and the pattern calls to press that seam open. So I'll finger press with my fingers and make sure my unit is straight. Then take my iron and just set it on the unit for a count of 5 seconds. And I'll do that with both units. It's pretty easy to get your square set crooked if you're not careful about how you finger press those open and lay them open. So if your block is crooked, my recommendation always is to make sure that you're pressing it straight. If you press it in a straight rectangle, it will stitch together in a straight rectangle. For step 2, you're to take the 2 units and put them together, and you can use a pin to match that center seam. You can use a fork pin, which is a 2-prong pin that goes on both sides of the seam. And when you're stitching, when you get to the seam allowance, drop your needle into the seam allowance and remove the fork pin, and that will keep that seam from wiggling on you. If you don't have any fork pins, you can use a traditional pin, but pin on what I call the uphill side of the seam. So it's pinned ahead of the seam. As I stitch down a 1/4 inch, when I get to that seam allowance, again, I'll put my machine needle into the seam allowance, stop, remove the pin, and then keep going. That will keep the seam from wiggling and moving on me as I finish off that 4 patch. Oftentimes we feel like we have nested the seam and we can feel it. We stitch it, we open it up, and they aren't quite matched up. And that's because the seam has pushed, the machine has pushed the seam. So let's take a look at how that works. Using a traditional pin, I have that seam pinned above the seam. I have a beginner in my machine, one of my 9 patches, and I will go ahead and stitch it a 1/4 inch. Slow down as I get to the pin, and as the needle passes through the seam allowance, I'll stop and pull the pin. Match up those bottom edges and finish my 1/4 inch seam. Again, I like to use beginners and enders instead of just taking the unit out of my machine. So I have all of my little 9 patch units sitting on the side, ready for me to stitch. So I can open that up, and yes, those seams are nested perfectly. In step 2, now that I've got those 2 units stitched together, the instructions say to press this seam open as well. And again, I just set the iron there for a count of 5 seconds. Now you might be asking yourself why we're pressing the seams open, why we are not just pressing one direction or the other, because they would nest quite nicely. And that is true. They would nest quite nicely. The reason why we are pressing those seams open is that later in the unit, we'll be matching those seams up with this flying geese. And if our seams were pressed one direction or the other, that would be an awful lot of bulk right here for pressing. So to make the full look of the block look much cleaner and sit much nicer, we press those seams open. On step 3, we're going to be making the flying geese units. We'll be using the 1/4 square triangle and some 1/2 square triangles that we had cut previously. You'll take the 1/2 square triangle and lay it on your background 1/2 square so that the 90-degree angle matches up nice and straight here. If you have engineered your corners as I have, it should lay on there perfectly. If you've not engineered your corners, you're going to have a 3/8 of an inch overlap here, but this point will match up perfectly. You're going to stitch that unit from the point to the 90-degree angle. So from the point to the 90-degree angle. Go ahead and do that for both of those flying geese units. Once you have stitched that on, you're going to set the seam by pressing the iron to the top, flipping it open, and then pressing to the outside. And just set the iron there for 5 seconds. You'll do that for both units. And now we're ready for the other side of that flying geese. So in the same fashion, we'll take the other half square triangle, and again, matching that straight edge, set it on that unit, and we're going to stitch from the corner to the point of the flying geese. So again, we're going to stitch this direction. In order to do that, I need to turn it over so it can go into my machine this way. And the reason why I do that is so that I'll be stitching into this seam instead of stitching away from it and pushing that seam. It will help make that flying geese have a more true point and more true 1/4 inch point. Once I have the second half of my flying geese set on there, I go ahead and set the seam with my iron and press to the outside. And you can see I've got a nice true 1/4 inch there. If I had not already engineered my corners, I would need to trim the dog ears off at this point. In step 4, we'll be adding the flying geese unit to the side of the unit. So I like to lay them out so I can see how I'm doing that. And this is the way my fabric will be. So I'll just flip this over to make a sandwich. And it's going to be important that you match the center of that flying geese with the center of your seam. And the way that I do that is I take a pin and I will put it right through the apex, the center of that point. And because I'm a quilter, I know where 1/4 inch is. And so roughly a 1/4 inch, I'll put it through the center of that seam. Make sure that it's in there nice and perpendicular and straight. And it'd be real tempting to just bend the pin like this to go ahead and pin it in place. But if I do that, I will actually shift my fabric up. So I don't want to do that. I'm going to hold it in place. I'll remove the pin and then drop it back in. Stitching a 1/4 inch, I like to stitch with the flying geese on top so I can see where that seam is and I know where I need to pass my needle through as I'm stitching. The pressing instructions on step 4 indicate that you should be pressing towards the 4-patch unit. So you'll do that by, again, setting your seam with the iron and then turning that over and pressing. Once again, this unit will be as straight as you make it. You have to press it straight in order for it to lie straight. And you'll notice that my points of my flying geese have matched up perfectly with the seam that I was trying to match it to. In step 5, you'll be taking a square, background square, and stitching it to the side of your remaining flying geese unit. My background squares have directional fabric, but again, because I'm not necessarily trying to make them look like they're going a certain direction, I'm purposefully going to switch that around. Turn it like a sandwich. Match up those corners and those points, and go ahead and stitch a 1/4 inch. Step 5 calls for you to press to the outside towards that square. So you set the seam with your iron, flip it over, and press. Now this unit will be prepared and ready for me to match up that seam here. And again, I can use a fork pin that goes on both sides of that seam, or I could use a straight pin. And similar to what I did in step 4, I will be taking my straight pin, passing it through the apex, and then a 1/4 inch. And if you have to, you might have a little bit of easing to do, which I do right there, but you just make that up in the seam. In step 6, it tells you to press that unit to the inside. So again, you turn it over to the side that you're pressing it to. Set the seam. And then flip it open. Setting the iron in place, and it may take a little more than 5 seconds because you've got that bulk from those flying geese. And so there we are. At this point, that part of the unit should measure 5 inches square. Now we're ready to add the bottom legs of the baby basket. On step 7, you apply the remaining 2 half squares to your rectangles, your background rectangles, and you will match up the 90-degree angles. And if you have not engineered corners, then you're going to have a 3/8 inch overlap here, and you'll stitch from the 90-degree angle to the corner, 90-degree angle to the corner. You'll note that these have a direction to them, that they go 2 different directions. So one will angle to the left and one will angle to the right. The pattern calls for you to press these seams open. Again, you're doing that to reduce bulk in your quilt. So finger press them first and then set those seams and press. Again, you're trying very hard to keep this nice and straight. So you finger press that seam open. And set the iron there for 5 seconds. When you finish, you'll have 2 units, each of them angled the opposite direction. Step 8 of the pattern calls for you to take the units from step 7 and apply them to the sides of the 5-inch block that you have from step 6. You're going to match those pressed open seams with the pressed open seams here. And if you have engineered corners, they're going to match up evenly. If you don't, they're going to overlap 3/8 of an inch. And you're going to stitch from that outside edge into the point. You'll stitch first one side and press it to the outside, then the other. So I'm going to flip this over like a sandwich, match those seams up. I can use my fork pin or I can use a straight pin. Keep those seams matched up. And then I will stitch a 1/4 inch from this point straight through the end of the unit. I have one side of the unit from step 8 stitched on, and I am to press to the outside. So I'll set that seam, fold it over, and press to the outside. Again, holding my iron in place for 5 seconds. And you can see we've got those seams matched up quite nicely. Now I will take the last unit, fold it over like a sandwich, pin that in place. And again, I'll be stitching, I'll turn it over, and I will be stitching from the top of the unit to the bottom. It is very tempting to just go ahead and try to stitch from the bottom to the outside. But what can happen is that seam can move. And so it's really important to go the right direction. And now that I have that second side on, I will again set the seam and then press it to the outside. Again, just setting that iron on there for 5 seconds. I know I sound like a broken record, but that method really works well. You can see I have a good 1/4 inch here. If I had dog ears, this is where I would trim my dog ears. To take a 1/2 square triangle, and you should have a leftover one from row 1, and apply it to the bottom of the unit, matching your centers. You can use the pinch method. In my case, I have engineered corners so I can see that it matches really nicely. I like to drop a pin in that center, and once again, I'm going to stitch it from this side so I can see as I pass through that 1/4 inch. So that way I get to keep my points nice and true. And the last instruction on step 9 is pressing. You'll set the seam and press to the outside. And that completes your baby bunting block. That's hard to say. If you have any questions along the way, give me a call, send me an email, do a post on our group Facebook page, and we'll get back to you as soon as we possibly can to answer any questions that you might have. I thank you for joining us and have a blessed day.